Hello and welcome to the second lecture on human rights. In this lecture, we will be basically discussing about all the kind of rights which we take up in this course or in these courses, because there are 2 to 3 courses which we run under the name of human rights for different I will say courses or different streams. So let us see what are these rights. Before these parts, allow me to also tell you that we also discuss a lot of boring stuff on human rights, like when human rights came, what are the divisions of human rights, what are the properties of human rights, and so on. But right now I'm not discussing about all these things, because those we will be taking in between. Once we will have a basic idea of certain things, and after that, once we will be discussing those theoretical issues, so it will make more sense. So right now I'm leaving that part and coming to the topics as such, and after that we will be discussing about those things as well. So if you see in the list, the first name comes as ragging. Now, ragging is not an international human rights violation. In fact, a lot of countries do not understand or know even what is ragging. But it is definitely a problem, or it was a problem in Commonwealth countries. And a lot of countries, including our own country, has passed laws to stop ragging completely in the educational institutions of our nation, and have completely banned and have completely taken it off from the educational institutions. So, and in Supreme Court, in its own decision, the Supreme Court of India, in its own decision, has called ragging as a human rights violation. Now, there are a lot of issues regarding ragging, or there used to be a lot of issues, even if it has been banned in educational institutions across nation. You will still find some cases of ragging coming up. Okay, in the COVID environment and in this lockdown period, and when there are no classes or college or say schools which are going on normal basis, so this may not be a problem, right? Because right now students are not coming to the classes physically, they are attending classes online and so on, so ragging is not a problem. Or else, irrespective of the fact that it has been banned, it still is a small problem in our country, though not as big as it was, but still there are some hue and cry also related to ragging many a times. And even the top educational institutions have say witnessed these kind of problems in our country. So ragging has been considered by the Honorable Supreme Court of India as a basic human rights violation, and therefore we also have our say in ragging as a human rights violation. So this is not an international human rights violation, but definitely it is pertaining to certain nations, and in our country definitely it is one of the basic human rights violation. So we will be discussing certain things about ragging. Next comes censorship. Now, censorship is something again which we do not have a very clear idea about, because we understand censorship as like the movies are censored, because every time we go to a theater and watch a movie, so we will find the censor board of India and its rating of that movie and its certification. And we also come to know that there were some violent or some sexually explicit material which has been say banned, and so on. So usually we understand it from the movie's perspective or from this thing. But censorship is a very broad notion, and it basically stops or puts a check on or hinders the expression of an individual. So that becomes a human rights violation sometimes, because if the broadcasting rights, if the media is not having say freedom of expression and so on, so these things becomes also human rights violation. So we will talk in detail about these kind of things under the head of censorship. Next, if you see, is a topic called political prisoners. Now, these are not normal prisoners. They are not, they have not, say, committed a crime or are repeat offenders of certain normal crimes. Rather than, they are those people who have expressed their opinion against the government. And not every government in this world is a democratic nation. And even if democratic nation also, there are not absolute expressions, right? The freedom of expression is not an absolute right. Even in our country, it is not an absolute right. So certain kind of expressions are debarred, or certain kind of expressions if you express against the government, against the state, so those are not accepted, and because of that these people are imprisoned. Now these people are imprisoned, and because of that also there are certain human rights violations, like that in our country there is a problem called house arrest. In the neighboring country of Pakistan, most of the rulers of their nation are exiled, right? Uh, in Southern American countries, the Latin American countries, you will find a problem called disappearance. We also have it in our country, uh, but mostly we will find it in Southern American countries. There's something called disappearance. Disappearances simply mean that the person has disappeared. Now, whether he has died, or he has been deported, or he has been put to slavery, or so on, never knows. Nobody knows, in fact, but they completely are gone through. There is also something called extrajudicial executions, right? Extrajudicial executions mean that if the judiciary is unable to, say, punish a offender, so what happens is that the government takes a step. Usually the police or the law enforcing authorities take a step to execute the person without judiciary. That is what we call as extrajudicial execution. In common language, it will be called as an encounter, right? So that is also there. So those things are also called as human rights violations. There is also something called custodial death. Now, like suppose somebody is in custody, whether somebody is in judicial custody or somebody is serving a term in a jail or a prison, and he or she has been executed because of beatings, because of torture, because of so many things, or the person has even committed a suicide, is also called as a custodial death. So those things also need to be understood, and those are also becoming a human rights violation. Why they become human rights violation, how this human rights violation takes place, and what is the role of state in that, and so on. We will be discussing about that as well. Next is torture. Torture is a basic human rights violation, and torture is something no nation in this world is bereft from this. Like, there will be a lot of nations where death penalty is not there. We will come to death penalty, right? So in our country there is death penalty, in neighboring countries also there is death penalty, but in most of the developed nations, I'm not talking about United States of America, but say in Nordic nations or in Scandinavian nations, there is no death penalty, right? So you will find that death penalty is not a human rights violation across the say nations, or in this whole world. But torture is a human rights violation everywhere, because torture, if you see, it is to elicit information, right? It is to make a person speak about something, about the thing which he or she was planning to do, or to get certain kind of information. So, but why torture is a human rights violation, or why torture goes against the law? Because if you see law, so if you see any law book, you are understood as innocent unless you are proven guilty, right? So you are termed as innocent unless or until you are proven guilty. But in torture, the policy or the principle is completely different. There you are guilty unless you are proven innocent, right? And because of that, you have to go through a lot of physical, mental, and so on tortures, which is painful for a human being. So torture is also something which we will be studying. Next comes death penalty. Now, people have very different say about death penalty. A lot of people, especially the human rights activists, will say that death penalty is a human rights violation and it needs to be completely taken off. Whereas cultures, people, and society at large think that death penalty is a necessity in a lot of nations, and people who have committed heinous crime, or in our country we call it the rarest of the rare crime, so those people have to be awarded death penalty. Like many people will, or many people are still waging a war, or waging a revolution, that people who are rapists, right, they should be also awarded death penalty, right? So a lot of things like this happen. So the whole of the world is divided in on this notion that whether death penalty should be there or whether death penalty should not be there. And you will find that in the human rights parlance, it is called as a human rights violation. However, a lot of nation, including developed nations like United States of America, still has death penalty in there. Not all the states of United States of America has death penalty, but definitely some states do have. Next is apartheid. Now, apartheid is basically a principle of segregation between individuals. It has started with the understanding of color, right? Because if you see, say 100 years back, 150 years back, so there was slavery and there was apartheid. We will come to slavery as well. Apartheid was basically a principle of distinction as well as discrimination based on the color of the skin, color of the eye, color of the hairs, and so on. Because there was a white supremacy principle. So whites considered themselves as the superior class, and the browns came second, and the blacks came third, and then there were so many other distinctions as well. And because of that, not all the rights which were provided to the whites were provided to the browns or to the blacks, right? And they have very different names. Somebody will call them mulattoes, somebody will call them negroes, somebody will call them something, somebody will call them something else. So all these things were there, and they were having very different principles, and it was a state organized principle that the state used to give certain kind of rights to certain kind of people and were not given to certain other kinds of people. But apartheid is not only a concept based on the color of the skin. That is something which you need to understand. Apartheid is a principle which is a segregation on the basis of anything. Like there is gender apartheid for that matter. Like you must be knowing that a lot of countries still do not allow their women to vote, do not allow their women to drive, and so on. I will talk in detail about all these things in apartheid. So the first thing which should be there in your mind is that apartheid, though predominantly speaking, it talks about the color of the skin. But actually, it is not only the color of the skin. It is any kind of segregation. Like in India, we have casteism, or even if we have removed casteism from the legal code, but still it is practiced in some fashion or the other. And similarly, even if apartheid has been removed or has been completely eradicated from the world, there are a lot of laws which has been passed, and there is no country now which practices apartheid in their nation on the basis of color. The African nations which used to practice also stopped practicing that by 1990s. But still, racism exists in the mind of the people, right? So those things and those questions we will be dealing in the apartheid part. So slavery is also a byproduct of that, or in fact, they are dependent on each other. Apartheid and slavery are very, very dependent notions. So wherever there was apartheid, there was also a policy of slavery. And slaves are not only certain things which came in the modern world or in the late medieval world. It was practiced right from the very beginning, right? So if you remember any Greek movie or any Roman movie or something like that, so you will hear these notions or quotes like French, or say friends, Romans, countrymen, women, slaves, and so on. All these things were there, and they were different categories. They were completely different categories of people, and they used to also practice different kind of policies for those people. So slaves were an integral part of the society, and slavery was a notion of pride, right? People used to take a lot of pride that, okay, I have 100 slaves, I have 500 slaves, I'm the king, I'm having 50,000 slaves, and so on. So all these things were there, and slaves were even put to barter, they were traded off, and so on. All these things were there. So that has been removed. But then the world is not bereft of slavery. The world is still having slavery, and the new form of slavery has come. The old forms of slavery, we will discuss about the old forms of slavery as well in this course. Those has been taken care of. Those have been completely removed, I guess so. But then the new form of slavery has come, and it is even more dangerous. So we will talk about those things in the slavery part of this course. Next comes genocide. Now, genocide is usually understood as mass killing of individuals, right? But how it is different from homicide is something which becomes a question, because homicide can also be mass killing of individuals. So a proper understanding of genocide will be that it is targeted killing, right? That you are targeting certain kind of groups or some kind of people. So because of that, you are calling it a genocide. Fine. But genocide is not only mass killing of individuals. This is something which you should also understand. Genocide is actually creating an environment so that people do not exist anymore. It can be anything. There are a lot of ways in which, like, if you do not allow people to procreate or give birth to people, there is some kind of contraceptions, or there kind of some kind of forcibly putting certain kind of situations so that people do not procreate, or their progenies do not come, or the next generation is not coming, or forcefully transferring children from one group to another group, so that the because the idea of genocide is to kill the idea of one class or one group of people. So those things, and what are the issues, and what are all those things, we will be discussing also in genocide. There is another human rights violation, and this is the problem which the 21st century is facing these days a lot, and that is called as the problem of refugees. Now, what happens is that a lot of countries are not stable nations, and there are a lot of problems with those nations. And those problems not is it's not only warfare; it can be environmental, it can be economic, and because of that, there is mass movement of people from one place to another place, and they want to travel across and go to some other developed country and want to stay and put up over there and find their livelihood and so on, or because of the problem of persecution, they are running away from those nations. So the problem of refugees is becoming bigger and bigger. And now, as you know, that two countries have already started warfare, like the Azerbaijan and the Armenia. So this will also result in a lot of refugees, because a lot of people, a lot of normal civilians will run away from one place to another place in search of shelter, food, kind of basic living, right? And the neighboring nations may not allow them to enter, or may allow them to enter, but then they will give them a status which will be very, very reprehensible, or very, very inhuman by nature. So that understanding creates the problem of refugees. What are the problems of refugees? How this world is tackling this problem, and the problem is becoming bigger and bigger. What needs to be done, and all these things we will be discussing in the refugees. Now let us come to the last four topics. These are basic topics. We may not be able to cover all of them, because depending upon which course in which you are, and what is the credit, what is the number of lectures we will be taking, all those things. But we will be comprehensive. We will be having a very brief idea of most of the things. Now let us come to these four things: women rights, children rights, abortion, and euthanasia. Most of us know about all these things, that there are a lot of problems with women. Even abortion is a problem with women. But there are a lot of other problems also related to women, like forced contraception or forced sterilization. Then there are problems with dignity. They are not given equal status. They do not have political rights, because not many many countries do not allow them to vote even. Uh, then there is something called FGM. FGM, you might not be aware of. It's called female genital mutilation. So that is also a problem with women in many countries of this world. So we will be dealing with all those things. In our country, there was a problem called sati, right? So those things also, and there is also something called witch hunting in our country, right? So all these things, all these small small things which are targeted against the women, we will be discussing under women rights. There are also, because both these women and children are the most vulnerable section of the society, right? So there are a lot of children rights abuse as well. Like, children are put to work. You will find in our country a lot of children who are below the age of 14 years are working in small dhabas or restaurants and cleaning and doing some very, very menial work. They are also working in very dangerous factories like cracker making factories or matchstick producing factories. Very, very dangerous. Okay, and this is not something which is allowed, but still not much is done against them. And there are also children who are working as servants at a lot of places. So all these things are there. Then children are also made as soldiers. Not in our country, but in a lot of nations, children have been used as soldiers. Um, so those things are also problematic. So we will be discussing about children rights. So women rights and children rights we will talk about. These two topics, abortion and euthanasia, are very important topics these days. And we will be holding a couple of lectures on both of them. That what are the debates for and against abortion, right? A lot of people think that abortion is a basic human right, and the women should be given the right to choose whether she will like to give birth to the baby or she will not like to give birth to the baby. The other set of people will say that the right of the baby is also important, right? That baby is a potential human being and he or she need not be killed because a certain other person is thinking that we should not give birth to that baby. So that discussion or that line of argument is a very, in fact, both the arguments are very strong arguments, and it is very difficult sometimes to even decide uh, which way to go. So we will talk about those discussions in abortion. Euthanasia. A lot of hue and cry. Like, allow me to question. Human rights activists say that death penalty is a basic human rights violation and it should not be there by the state, or the state should not kill somebody. Hmm? You can take punitive action, you can put somebody for lifelong imprisonment and so on, but you should not kill a person because the right is the life is given by somebody else and should be taken by somebody else. You do not have a role to play. So that idea is there. Uh, but on the other hand, in euthanasia, they say euthanasia, you can call it mercy killing, you can also call it assisted killing, right? Because I am not, like, suppose if I am good enough to commit suicide, I can always commit suicide, right? So nobody can stop me from that. However, whether suicide is a human rights violation or not is something also which is a question, and we will have a glimpse of that as well when we will be discussing euthanasia. But let us see. Like right now, I am not in a condition, I am in a vegetative condition. I cannot kill myself, but my condition is so bad that I do not want to live anymore. Or maybe I have lived my life and I have met with a fatal accident, or I am in coma, or something or the other is there. So there are two types of euthanasia, in fact, voluntary and involuntary. So we will be discussing about that as well. But like, suppose if I want to be killed or I do not want to live anymore, so whether I have the right to decide about my death, right? And whether I should not have the right. So human rights activists will say, most of the human rights activists, because again, human rights activists, you cannot call somebody a human rights activist because they only follow one trail, right? There are different types and they have different arguments against it as well, or for it as well. So, but many of the human rights activists will say that yes, people should have the right, but the state, mostly, and in most of the countries, the state does not allow euthanasia, right? And why it is the case, or whether assisted killing should be given more freedom, or whether people should not be killed by euthanasia. What are the problems? What are the problems legally? What is the slippery slope argument in that, and so on? We will be discussing about all these things. So comprehensively, if we speak, we have these topics under the human rights, but not all the topics will be there in your course. It depends in which course you are, but we will have a very good idea about all these things. And as I told you, that the state is not always at fault. Similarly, my duty in this course will be to tell you or to expose the arguments both in favor as well as against it. I do not hold an opinion. I Even if I hold, I will not let you know, because that is not the idea that I should put my opinion on you. Rather than you should develop your opinion. We will be exposing the arguments for as well as against these notions, but then you have to decide that what should be the way of dealing with things. Because look, you are the future of our country, and we expect you to take decisions rather than the old people taking decisions for the younger people, right? So the things are there in your hand, and what are the problems of the state, what are the problems of the individuals, right? And all these things we will be understanding. And in between, somewhere when we will be covering some amount of course, we will be talking also about certain theoretical aspects of human rights, which I'm not writing here, and definitely, as I told you, that it's going to be very boring. But after covering some topics, you will have you will also feel the necessity that now we need to be theoretically stronger as well, to understand and to decide what is right, what is wrong, why it is correct, why it is incorrect, and so on. So we will be discussing certain basic aspects of human rights as well. We will be also discussing the 30 articles. There are 30 articles in UDHR. So we will be discussing about those as well. So you will have the idea that people have a lot of rights, or people should be given a lot of rights which are not provided. Like for that matter, the right to marriage is a human rights, is a human right, right? But if people do not have the right to marry, or people do not have the right to marry by their own choice, so it is also a basic human rights violation. So, but not all these things are covered here. But once we will be discussing the articles, so you will have a better idea that what else we need to discuss or understand. So given this, I will close this lecture here with this understanding that now you have an idea that what are those things which we will be discussing in this course.